Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the long arm of the law often falls short, and justice must be delivered by a steady hand and a cold eye. In some towns, evil puts down roots so deep it chokes the very soul of the place, convincing everyone that it's just the way things are. But sometimes, a lone wind blows in from the desolate plains, a wind that carries the scent of gunpowder and retribution. Tonight's story is about such a wind, a quiet cowboy who drifted into a town that had forgotten hope, and reminded them what true fear felt like. A story we call The Shadow of Jericho. The town of Jericho was not a town, it was a kingdom. Its borders were not marked by surveyor's lines, but by the far-reaching shadow of fear cast by one man, Cain. Cain was not a mayor or a judge, he was a tyrant, a land baron who had built an empire of rust and dust on the foundations of intimidation and bloodshed. He owned the only saloon, the only hotel, the only bank, and the only lawman. The people of Jericho were not citizens, they were subjects, heads bowed, spirits broken, living out their days in a quiet, simmering servitude. Cain's enforcers were a pack of wolves known as the rustlers. They were a collection of the territory's most vicious and desperate men, loyal not to a cause, but to the steady flow of Cain's coin and the free rein he gave their cruelest impulses. They were led by a man named Silas, the gaunt, cold-eyed killer who served as Cain's shadow and his executioner. The rustlers were an occupying army in their own town, their presence a constant, low-grade terror. A rancher who spoke out against Cain might find his well poisoned. A merchant who refused to pay the exorbitant protection fees might find his store burned to the ground. The people had learned long ago that the price of defiance was a shallow and marked grave in the Boot Hill cemetery that overlooked the town like a silent, grim warning. The rustlers, and Cain himself, had come to believe in their own mythology. They were untouchable. They were the law of the power, and the gods of this small, forgotten corner of the world. They had crushed all opposition, silenced all dissent, and extinguished all hope. They had forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. They were about to be reminded. He arrived on a Tuesday, at high noon, the worst possible time for a man to ride into a new town. He came from the west, a lone, dark figure materializing out of the shimmering, blinding heat of the plains. He was not a gunslinger of obvious renown. He was not dressed in black, and his gun belt was not tied low on his hip. He was dressed in the simple, trail-worn clothes of a common cowboy, his face shadowed by the brim of a dusty, unassuming hat. He rode a powerful but unremarkable buckskin horse, and he led a pack mule carrying a simple bedroll and a few supplies. He was utterly, completely ordinary, and in a town like Jericho, that in itself was a suspicious thing. People did not come to Jericho by accident. He rode the length of the main street, his pace unhurried. He didn't look at the hard-faced rustlers who watched him from the saloon porch, their hands resting near their guns. He didn't seem to notice the fearful, averted gazes of the few townspeople who scurried across the street. His eyes, as startlingly pale and piercing blue, scanned the town with a quiet, appraising intensity, as if he were not seeing a town, but memorizing a map. He dismounted in front of the livery stable, the one business in town Cain didn't directly own, run by a grizzled, one-armed old man named Pop. Horse and mule need a rub-down and feed, the stranger said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that seemed at odds with his unassuming appearance. I'll be needing a room for a few days. Pop, who had seen 100 brave and foolish men ride into Jericho and be carried out, looked the stranger up and down. He saw nothing remarkable, except for the stillness. The man was as still as a predator waiting in the tall grass. Ain't no rooms at the hotel for strangers, Pop said, his voice a gruff warning. Not unless you got business with Mr. Cain. My business is my own, the stranger replied, his voice still quiet, but with an underlying edge of hard, polished steel. But I'll pay for my room. And my silence. He tossed a silver dollar onto a hay bale. It was a simple, honest coin, but the way he threw it, the easy, confident finality of the gesture, spoke of a man who was not asking for a favor. Before Pop could answer, 3 of the rustlers swaggered over from the saloon, their spurs jingling, their expressions a mixture of boredom and casual menace. Well, the leader, a burly man with a broken nose, sneered. What have we got here? A new stray. The stranger did not turn to face them. He continued to unsettle his horse. We're talking to you, friend, the man said, taking a step closer. "You deaf?" The stranger slowly turned. He was not a large man, but he seemed to grow in stature as he faced them. His pale blue eyes were no longer just appraising, they were as cold and as empty as a winter sky. "I hear you," he said. "This is Kane's town," the thug said, puffing out his chest. "We don't like strangers. We suggest you get back on your horse and ride out before the sun sets. It's for your own health." The stranger was silent for a long moment. He looked from one man's face to the next, his gaze lingering, as if committing them to memory. "I've heard of Jedediah Kane," he said finally, his voice a low, almost conversational tone. "I hear he's a man who takes what isn't his. I hear he's a man who mistakes fear for respect. I hear his men are loud, but their aim is poor." The insult, delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, hung in the hot, still air. The broken-nosed man's face turned a deep, blotchy red. "Why, you son of a—" He reached for his gun. He never cleared the holster. The stranger's right hand moved in a blur, a movement of impossible, poetic speed. It was not the flashy, dramatic draw of a dime novel hero. It was a simple, economical motion, a straight line from his hip to the target. The cold peacemaker seemed to materialize in his hand, and it roared once. The shot was not aimed to kill. It was aimed to humiliate. The bullet struck the thug's gun hand, shattering the bone and sending his pistol spinning into the dust. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of pure pain and shock, as he clutched his ruined hand. The other two rustlers stood frozen, their mouths agape, their own hands hovering uselessly near their weapons. They had just witnessed a level of speed and precision that they had only heard about in stories. The stranger did not look at the two remaining men. He kept his cold gaze fixed on the screaming man on the ground. "You were saying?" he asked quietly. He then, with a calm, deliberate motion, holstered his pistol. He turned his back on the three terrified, defeated men and looked at the stunned livery owner. "I believe you have a room for me," he said, as if nothing had happened. Pop, his one good hand trembling slightly, could only nod. The lone cowboy took his saddlebags and walked toward the hotel, leaving a wounded, whimpering thug in the dust and a town buzzing with a new, unfamiliar emotion, a flicker of hope, inextricably mixed with a terrible, chilling fear. No one knew his name. No one knew why he was here. They only knew that the untouchable kingdom of Jedediah Kane had just been touched, and that the long, peaceful reign of the rustlers was about to come to a very bloody, very personal end. The shadow had arrived in Jericho. The news of the incident at the livery stable spread through Jericho like a fever. For the first time in a decade, one of Jedediah Kane's rustlers had been publicly humiliated, shot and disarmed in the middle of the street by a stranger who had then calmly walked away. The townspeople, long accustomed to the casual brutality of the rustlers, reacted with a mixture of terrified and a dangerous, long-forgotten flicker of hope. The rustlers themselves, who had come to see themselves as invincible, were shaken. Their authority, built on a foundation of unchallenged fear, had just developed its first crack. Up in his sprawling ranch house, the self-proclaimed Jericho Palace, Jedediah Kane was not amused. He was a man who prized order and absolute control above all else. This stranger, this nameless, quiet cowboy, was a chaotic element, a stone dropped into the placid, stagnant pond of his kingdom. "Find out who he is," Kane ordered his second-in-command, the cold-eyed Silas. "I want to know where he comes from, what he wants, and why he's in my town. And I want him dealt with quietly. I want this town to understand that this was a fluke, a bit of drunken foolishness, not a sign of weakness." Silas, a man who preferred the clean, efficient language of violence, was only too happy to oblige. He chose 3 of his best men for the task. Not the loud-mouthed brawlers who loitered on the saloon porch, but quiet, competent killers. Their target was a man named Coyote Dan, one of the rustlers who had been with the gang from the beginning. Coyote was a tracker and a hunter, a man as comfortable in the dark, rugged hills surrounding Jericho as he was in a saloon. He was known for his skill with a throwing knife and his particular talent for making people disappear. The plan was simple. The stranger was staying in the hotel. That night, after the town was asleep, they would slip into his room and end the problem before it had a chance to grow. The lone cowboy, who had registered at the hotel under the simple, anonymous name of Smith, seemed oblivious to the storm he had created. He spent the afternoon in his room, and then took his evening meal in the hotel's quiet, respectable dining room, a place the common rustlers avoided. He ate slowly, his back to a solid wall, his pale blue eyes calmly scanning the room, missing nothing. He then retired to his room, and the light in his window went out shortly after. Just after midnight, Silas's three killers, led by Coyote Dan, made their move. They moved through the back alleys of the town like ghosts, their boots making no sound in the dust. They slipped into the hotel through a rear entrance Coyote had unlocked earlier. They crept up the stairs, their pistols drawn, the only sound the faint, nervous creak of a floorboard. They reached the stranger's room, 7, at the end of the hall. Coyote Dan, with the practiced skill of a burglar, picked the simple lock in a matter of seconds. He eased the door open, a sliver at a time, and peered into the darkness. He could see the shape of a man in the bed, a still, sleeping form under a thin blanket. With a silent hand signal, the three of them slipped into the room, fanning out, their guns pointed at the bed. This was the easy part. A sleeping man was no match for three armed killers. Coyote Dan gave a final nod. They all fired at once. The roar of the three pistols was deafening in the small, enclosed space. The mattress on the bed erupted in a shower of cotton and horsehair, the bullets thudding into the wall behind it. But the figure in the bed did not move. It did not cry out. A cold, sudden dread washed over Coyote Dan. He realized, a split second too late, that something was terribly wrong. The figure in the bed was not a man. It was a decoy, a bedroll and a pillow arranged to look like a sleeping person. From the darkest corner of the room a voice, as calm and as cold as a winter night, spoke a single word: mistake. Before they could react, a shape detached itself from the shadows near the wardrobe. It was the stranger. He was not armed with a pistol. In his right hand, he held a long, thick, and perfectly coiled lariat. He moved with a speed that defied belief. The rope uncoiled with a soundless hiss. The loop, wide and heavy, flew across the room. It settled not over one man, but over two, the clumsy brutes who had been standing side by side. The stranger did not pull back to tighten the rope. He simply planted his feet and held on. At the same time, from his left hand, his Colt Peacemaker appeared, its report a single, deafening clap of thunder. The third gunman, who had been standing apart from the others, grunted and collapsed, a bullet hole neatly placed in his knee. The two men caught in the lariat, tangled and confused, tried to bring their guns to bear. But the stranger was already in motion, using their own weight and momentum against them, pulling them off balance. They crashed into each other, their guns discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as they fell in a heap. Coyote Dan, the hunter, was the only one left standing. He was a professional, and he reacted on pure instinct. He ignored the men on the floor and lunged for the stranger, a long, wicked-looking knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. But the stranger was expecting it. He dropped the rope and sidestepped the lunging attack, the knife blade slicing through empty air. He did not draw his gun again. He moved inside Coyote's guard, and the fight became a close, brutal, and silent affair. It was not the brawling of a saloon, it was the calculated, efficient violence of a man who understood anatomy. A block, a parry, a sharp, precise strike to the throat with the edge of his hand. Coyote Dan made a choked, gurgling sound and staggered back, his knife falling from his nerveless fingers, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief. He had been a master of this kind of fighting his entire life, and he had just been dismantled in a matter of seconds. The stranger picked up the fallen knife. He walked over to the two men who were still struggling to entangle themselves from the rope and stood over them. The wounded man on the floor had passed out from the pain. "Jedediah Kane," the stranger said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "Tell him he has made his second mistake. And tell him his next one will be his last." He then did a terrifying, unexpected thing. He took the knife and, with two quick, precise movements, he sliced the gun belts from the two conscious, terrified men, the blade cutting through the thick leather as if it were butter. He was not just disarming them, he was emasculating them, stripping them of the very symbol of their power. "Get out," he said. The two men scrambled to their feet, helping their wounded, unconscious partner, and fled from the room, their faces pale with a terror that was far deeper than the simple fear of a gunfight. They had come to kill a sleeping man, and they had instead found a waking nightmare. They had faced a man who could use a rope as a net, a pistol with surgical precision, and his bare hands with the skill of an assassin. The lone cowboy stood for a moment in the quiet, smoke-filled room. He looked at the ruined bed, at the bullet holes in the wall. He had not come to Jericho to hide. He had come to hunt. And he knew that the best way to hunt wolves was to make them come to you. He had fired his first shot in a war of nerves, and he knew that Jedediah Kane had just received the message loud and clear. The first wrestler had fallen, and the rest of the pack was now on notice. The return of the 3 failed assassins to the Jericho Palace was a grim, humiliating affair. They stumbled into Jedediah Kane's opulent, oak-paneled study, one of them shot, all of them disarmed and stripped of their bravado. They told their story in halting, fearful whispers, the tale of a ghost who fought with a rope and a gun, and the shadows themselves. Jedediah Kane listened, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His quiet, tidy solution had exploded in his face. He was not dealing with a common drifter or a glory-seeking gunslinger. He was dealing with a professional, a predator of the highest order. The stranger's message was clear. I know you're coming for me, and I am ready. So, Kane said, his voice a low, menacing purr that was more terrifying than a shout. He wants a war. Then by God, he will have one. But the stranger did not give him the war he expected. He did not ride out, guns blazing. He did not issue a challenge. He simply disappeared. For 3 days, he was not seen. His room at the hotel was empty. His horse and mule were gone from the livery. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The town of Jericho held its breath. The rustlers, unnerved by the stories of the fight in the hotel, grew jumpy and paranoid. They began to see the stranger's face in every shadow, to hear his footsteps in every gust of wind. The fear that they had so expertly wielded against the town was now beginning to seep into their own ranks. The stranger had not left. He had simply gone to ground, melting into the rugged and forgiving landscape that surrounded the town. He was using the time to do what he did best, to watch, to learn, to hunt. From the high, rocky ridges, he studied Kane's empire, not as a collection of buildings, but as a living organism. He mapped its arteries, its supply lines, its weaknesses. He saw the heavily guarded wagons that brought in the weekly payroll for Kane's men. He saw the corrupt cattle buyers who came to purchase the wrestled livestock that was the true source of Kane's wealth. He saw the secret nighttime meetings between Kane, the town's puppet sheriff, and a local judge. He was not just preparing for a gunfight, he was preparing to dismantle an entire criminal enterprise. His first strike was not against a man, but against Kane's money. The weekly payroll wagon was a heavy, iron-bound coach, always guarded by 4 of Kane's best men. The stranger knew that a direct assault on the open road would be suicidal. So, he used his cunning. He chose a spot on the trail, a narrow pass with a steep drop-off on one side. The night before the wagon was due, he spent hours preparing his trap. He didn't use dynamite. He used his rope and his knowledge of mechanics. He felled a massive pine tree, leaving it balanced precariously on the edge of the cliff above the road, held in place by a single, thick hemp rope. The next day, as the payroll wagon rumbled into the pass, the stranger, hidden in the rocks 100 yards away, raised a rifle. He did not aim at the guards. He aimed at the rope. A single shot, and the thick rope snapped. With a groaning, splintering roar, the massive pine tree crashed down onto the road, directly in front of the wagon. The lead horses screamed and reared, the wagon lurching to a halt. The guards, thrown into confusion, drew their weapons, firing wildly into the hills. But there was no second shot. There was no attack. There was only the massive, impassable roadblock. They were stranded, miles from town, with a wagon full of gold. It took them the better part of a day to clear the road. By the time they limped back into Jericho, long after dark, they were exhausted, unnerved, and empty-handed. While they had been working, a phantom had slipped down from the hills, slit the throat of the one man they had left guarding the rear, and had made off with the entire payroll. The theft of the payroll sent a shockwave through the rustlers. They were hired guns, motivated by greed, and their loyalty was only as strong as Kane's ability to pay them. Now, that ability was in question. Fights broke out in the saloon. Men began to grumble, to look at their employer with a new, resentful speculation. The stranger's second strike was even more audacious. He knew that the foundation of Cain's wealth was his massive herd of stolen cattle, which he kept in a secluded, well-watered valley known as the Devil's Bowl. The valley had only one entrance, a narrow, easily guarded canyon. The stranger did not try to steal the cattle. He did something far worse. Under the cover of a moonless night, he made his way to the valley. He did not go near the canyon entrance and its guards. He climbed the high, sheer cliffs that surrounded the valley, a feat of mountaineering that would have been impossible for a normal man. He carried with him a small, precious, and deadly cargo, a bundle of rags infected with anthrax, taken from a long-dead and diseased buffalo he had found in the high country. He lowered the bundle into the small spring that was the valley's only water source. The results, a week later, were catastrophic. A virulent plague swept through the herd. The cattle, Cain's true fortune, began to die by the hundreds. The Devil's Bowl became a charnel house, the air thick with the stench of death and decay. Cain's wealth, the very thing that gave him his power, was being wiped out. Jedediah Cain was a man possessed. He was being dismantled, piece by piece, by an enemy he could not see, a ghost who attacked his money, his resources, his very foundation. He sent out patrols, but they found nothing. They were hunting a phantom who left no tracks. The stranger was not just a gunslinger. He was a strategist, a ghost who was writing a ledger of his own. For every rancher Cain had ruined, a piece of Cain's own empire would be turned to ash. For every life that had been taken to build this kingdom of fear, a pillar of that kingdom would be pulled down. The lone cowboy had become a force of nature, a slow, methodical, and inescapable plague of justice. And he was just getting started. With Jedediah Cain's empire beginning to crumble from within, the lone cowboy shifted his focus. He had attacked the body of Cain's operation. Now he would attack its heart network of fear and complicity that held the town of Jericho in its thrall. He needed to turn the townspeople, to remind them that they were not just subjects, but men and women who had once known freedom. He needed an ally. He found one in the most unlikely of places, the town's undertaker. Elias Thorne was a quiet, bookish man, seemingly ill-suited to his grim profession. He was a man who saw the town's secrets not in whispers, but in the bodies that were brought to him, ranchers who fell from their horses, the prospectors who drowned in shallow creeks. He was a man who hated Cain and his rustlers, but whose fear had kept him in a state of silent, resentful servitude. The stranger came to him one night, not as a customer, but as a confessor. In the quiet, formaldehyde-scented confines of the mortuary, the stranger finally gave a piece of his story. He did not give his name, but he spoke of a small, peaceful town to the south, a town that had been destroyed by a cattle baron and his hired guns. He spoke of a wife and a young son, of a fire, of a promise made to ash and bone. The story was simple, unadorned, and delivered in a low, emotionless monotone that was more chilling than any scream of rage. Cain and Silas, the stranger said, his pale blue eyes seeming to look right through the undertaker. They were there. They were two of the men who lit the torches. Elias Thorne stared at him, a dawning horror on his face. He had heard whispers of a massacre in a town called Haven a few years back, a town that had been wiped off the map in a brutal land grab. He was looking at a survivor. A ghost? "What do you want from me?" the undertaker whispered, his voice trembling. "Information," the stranger said. "You know the secrets of this town. You know who Cain pays, who he threatens. You know who among the townspeople still has a spine. I am not just here to kill Cain. I am here to tear down his whole world. And I need a man on the inside." The undertaker, who had lived his life in the company of the dead, finally found the courage to fight for the living. He became the stranger's eyes and ears in the town. He would leave coded messages in a loose brick at the back of the cemetery, detailing the movements of the rustlers, the names of corrupt officials, the growing dissent among Cain's own men. Armed with this new intelligence, the stranger's war became even more precise, more psychological. He began to target not just the rustlers, but the corrupt infrastructure that supported them. The town's sheriff, a fat, cowardly man named Ben, was having a secret affair with the wife of the blacksmith. The stranger arranged for an anonymous note to be sent to the blacksmith, a large, powerful man with a notoriously violent temper. The resulting public brawl between the blacksmith and the sheriff shattered Behan's last shred of authority and made him a laughingstock. The judge who signed Cain's fraudulent land deeds had a secret, debilitating gambling addiction. The stranger, using some of the stolen payroll money, funded a high-stakes, crooked poker game and made sure the judge was invited. The judge, as expected, lost everything, signing away his Outlaws to a mysterious investor. He was now on his legal power neutered. The stranger was not just a killer, he was a master of human weakness. He was turning Kane's own corrupt world against him, using the sins of his allies to destroy them. With each small, precise strike, the web of power that Kane had so carefully woven began to unravel. The rustlers themselves were now living in a state of constant, paranoid terror. They were being hunted by an enemy who seemed to know their every move, their every secret. They started to turn on each other, old rivalries and resentments flaring into open violence. The pack was devouring itself. Kane, isolated in his Jericho palace, watched his empire crumble, a bewildered king on a dissolving throne. He was a man who understood brutality and greed. But this was something else. This was a patient, intricate, and deeply personal form of destruction. He felt as if his very soul was being dissected by a phantom surgeon. He finally realized that this was not a war for money or land. This was a haunting. He had not just created an enemy, he had created a ghost who was forcing him to relive his own past sins. The whispers of Haven, the town he had burned and forgotten, were now a roaring inferno in his mind. In a final, desperate act, he sent for the one man he knew was as cold, as competent, and as ruthless as the ghost who haunted him, his second-in-command, Silas. "I want him," Kane roared, his voice a raw, desperate thing. "I don't care what it takes. I don't care what you have to do. I want him found. I want him dragged before me. I want to look him in the eye before I kill him myself." Silas, the cold-eyed killer, listened. He understood that the game had changed. This was no longer a matter of controlling a town. This was a duel to the death between his master and a ghost from his own bloody past. And he, Silas, was now the only thing standing between them. He accepted the challenge. The hunter would now hunt the hunter. The final, bloody act of the tragedy of Jericho was about to begin. Silas was a different kind of animal from the other rustlers. Where they were jackals, loud and brutish, he was a viper, silent, patient, and possessed of a cold, reptilian intelligence. He understood that the stranger was not just a gunman, but a predator who used the landscape and psychology as his primary weapons. To catch a ghost, Silas knew, you couldn't rely on a posse. You had to set a perfect, irresistible trap. He began by studying his opponent. Through the terrified, disjointed accounts of the surviving rustlers, he pieced together a profile of the lone cowboy. The man was a master of stealth and ambush. He used deception. He turned his enemies' weaknesses against them. But Silas also identified what he believed was the stranger's single, exploitable flaw: a grim, theatrical sense of justice. The man didn't just kill, he made statements. The shot hand, the payroll theft, the cattle plague, the exposure of the sheriff and the judge, they were all acts designed to publicly dismantle Kane's empire. This was a man who needed an audience, a man who wanted the people of Jericho to witness his righteous vengeance. And that, Silas reasoned, was the key to his undoing. The trap Silas devised was one of cruel, simple genius. He chose the bait carefully. It could not be Kane. The stranger was too smart to fall for that. It had to be someone the stranger would perceive as an innocent, a symbol of the very people he was fighting for. The bait would be Pop, the one-armed livery owner, the closest thing the stranger had to a friend in Jericho. The plan was executed with a chilling precision. Two of Silas's men staged a clumsy, drunken argument in the middle of the street, right in front of the livery. Pop, as expected, came out to tell them to take their foolishness elsewhere. As he did, a third man accidentally knocked over a lantern into a pile of dry hay. The accident was perfectly timed. The front of the livery erupted in flames. In the ensuing chaos, Silas himself, unseen, clubbed the old man from behind and dragged him away. By the time the fire was put out, the livery was damaged, and Pop was gone. But he had not vanished entirely. Pinned to the smoldering door of the stable was a crudely written sign: "The old man talks too much. Kane's justice. Red Rock Canyon." It was a public declaration, a direct challenge. Red Rock Canyon was a well-known, desolate spot a few miles outside of town, a place of jagged cliffs and narrow, box canyons. It was a perfect place for an execution and an ambush. The news spread through Jericho, carried on whispers of fear and outrage. The undertaker, Elias Thorne, got a message to the stranger through their usual dead drop at the cemetery. The message was simple. It's a trap. Pop is the bait. They'll be waiting for you. The stranger, hidden in his high country lair, received the message and knew instantly what it was. He knew it was a trap. It was obvious, clumsy, and perfectly designed to appeal to his one perceived weakness. Silas was counting on him to come and play the hero, to ride in and try to save the innocent old man. And the stranger knew he had no choice but to go. To ignore the challenge would be to admit defeat, to show the townspeople that their silent champion was, in the end, a coward who would not risk his life for one of them. It would shatter the very legend he had so carefully constructed. He had to walk into the trap, but he would do it on his own terms. He did not ride toward Red Rock Canyon. He rode in the opposite direction, toward the Devil's Bowl, the valley where he had poisoned Cain's herd. He knew that Silas, being a careful man, would not have committed all his forces to the canyon. He would have left a rear guard to protect Cain. The stranger's attack on the Jericho Palace was a masterpiece of silent, deadly infiltration. While the bulk of the rustlers were playing hunter in the canyon, he slipped into Cain's fortress like a phantom. He bypassed the few remaining guards, his movements a whisper in the night, and he made his way not to Cain's chambers, but to his stables. He did not harm the horses. He simply opened the corral gates and, with a series of sharp, sudden noises, sent Cain's prized, thoroughbred horses stampeding into the night. It was a symbolic act, a stripping away of another of Cain's symbols of wealth and power. But it was also a diversion. As the few guards at the ranch scrambled to deal with the stampede, the stranger slipped into the house itself. He found Jedediah Cain alone in his study, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, his face a mask of paranoid anxiety as he waited for news from the canyon. The stranger did not kill him. He simply stepped from the shadows, his Colt a cold, steady presence in his hand. Cain looked up, and his face went slack with a terror so profound it was almost comical. "The hunt is over, Cain," the stranger said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "Silas is a clever man. He laid a good trap. But he forgot one thing." "What?" Cain stammered, his eyes wide. "He forgot that the hunter always has the better view," the stranger said. "Now, you and I are going for a ride." Out at Red Rock Canyon, Silas waited. The sun was beginning to set, painting the rocks a deep, bloody red. He had his best shooters hidden in the cliffs, a perfect, inescapable crossfire. He had Pop tied to a post in the center of the canyon floor. All he needed was for the ghost to appear. But the ghost did not come. Instead, a lone rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. It was one of his own men from the ranch, his face pale, his horse lathered. "Silas," the man yelled. "It's the ranch. The horses are gone. And so is Cain. He's taken the boss." The blood drained from Silas's face. The hunter had become the hunted. The complex, perfect trap he had laid had been for a decoy, while the real predator had circled around and taken his king right off the board. He had been outmaneuvered, his own strategy used against him. He screamed an order for his men to mount up, to ride back to the ranch. But as they scrambled from their positions, a single rifle shot echoed from the high cliffs at the opposite end of the canyon, the end that led deeper into the wilderness. The shot was not aimed at them. It was aimed at the rope that held Pop to the post. The rope snapped, and the old man, shocked but unharmed, scrambled for cover. It was a final, mocking message from the stranger. "I have your boss. I have freed your hostage. I was here all along, and you never even saw me." Silas and his men rode back to Jericho in a state of panic disarray. Their leader was gone, their prisoner was free, and their enemy was a ghost who could apparently be in two places at once. The perfect trap had not just failed, it had sprung back on the one who had set it. The hunter had become the hunted, and now, the viper was all alone. The kidnapping of Jedediah Cain was a masterstroke that shattered the last vestiges of the rustlers' authority. Their leader, the untouchable tyrant of Jericho, was now a hostage, his fate in the hands of the very ghost he had sought to destroy. The power vacuum was immediate and absolute. The remaining rustlers, a pack of wolves without an alpha, turned on each other, their fear and greed boiling over into a series of bloody, internal squabbles. Jericho was eating itself alive, and the lone cowboy didn't have to lift a finger. Silas, the cold-eyed viper, was the only one who remained focused. His loyalty to Cain was secondary to his own professional pride. He had been outmaneuvered, made to look like a fool, and that was a personal insult that could only be answered in blood. He knew this was no longer about the town or the gang. This was now a personal duel between him and the stranger. He received his invitation to that duel the next morning. A small, ragged boy, paid a few cents for the task, delivered a note to him at the saloon. The note was simple, written in a clean, steady hand. It told him to come alone to the old, abandoned mission on Jericho Mesa at sundown. It said to come for his boss. And it was signed with a simple, chilling drawing the small, coiled snake. Silas knew it was a final trap, but he also knew he had no choice but to go. To refuse was to admit defeat, to abandon his boss and flee like a coward. His entire reputation, his identity as a man to be feared, rested on this final confrontation. Jericho Mesa was a high, windswept plateau that overlooked the town, its flat top dominated by the crumbling adobe walls of a mission that had been abandoned for half a century. It was a place of ghosts and wind, a fitting stage for the final act. Silas rode up the winding trail as the sun began its long, bloody descent toward the horizon. He rode alone, as instructed, but he was a man prepared. He carried his usual Colt, but he also had a second, smaller pistol tucked into his boot and a long, wicked-looking knife strapped to his forearm. He was a viper, and vipers always have more than one fang. He reached the mesa and saw them. In the center of the ruined mission courtyard, Jedediah Cain was tied to a crumbling stone cross, the remains of the mission's old crucifix. He was gagged, but his eyes were wide with a pathetic, pleading terror. And standing beside him, his back to the setting sun, was the stranger. He stood, his arms crossed, his face a calm and readable mask in the dying light. "You came," the stranger said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. "I'm not a man who runs from a fight," Silas replied, dismounting slowly, his hands held open and away from his gun. "Let him go. This is between you and me." "He is the reason this is between you and me," the stranger said. He gave the order. "You lit the torch. You are two halves of the same coin." "That was a long time ago," Silas said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "Just business." "My son's life was not business," the stranger said, and for the first time, a flicker of the cold, burning fire behind his eyes was visible. "My wife's screams were not business." He walked over to Cain and, with a single, sharp cut of a knife, sliced the ropes that held him. Cain, his joints stiff, stumbled and fell to his knees. "Go on," the stranger said to the whimpering, broken man. "Run. Tell the devil I sent you." Cain, sobbing with a mixture of terror and relief, scrambled to his feet and began to run, stumbling like a drunken man, away from the two gunmen, toward the edge of the mesa. Silas watched him go, a look of contempt on his face. He had never respected Cain's weakness, only his power. Now that the power was gone, the man was nothing. His focus was entirely on the stranger. "Just us now," Silas said, his hand drifting down, hovering over the butt of his Colt. "Just us," the stranger agreed. The duel was a thing of terrible, silent beauty. It was not the frantic, clumsy gunplay of a saloon brawl. It was a contest between two masters of their deadly art. They stood 50 feet apart, two dark silhouettes against the blood-red sky, the wind whispering through the ruined arches of the old mission. They drew at the same instant, their movements a mirror image of speed and economy. Two pistols roared as one, the sound a single, deafening clap that echoed across the mesa. The stranger felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left side as Silas's bullet tore through flesh and muscle. He grunted, stumbling back a step, but his own aim had been true. Silas stood for a second, a look of profound, almost academic surprise on his face. A small, dark hole had appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it, then back up at the stranger. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gout of blood came out. He then collapsed, his body hitting the dusty ground with a heavy finality. The viper was dead. The stranger stood there, panting, his side a furnace of agony. He had won. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was not over. He turned his gaze to where Cain had run. The cowardly cattle baron had reached the edge of the mesa and was now scrambling down a steep, rocky trail, trying to get to the horse he had hidden there earlier. And it was then that the stranger realized the true genius of Silas's final, desperate plan. Silas had known he might lose the duel. He had known the stranger would be wounded. And he had known that Cain, the ultimate coward, would run. And he had planned for it. From the rocks below, where Cain was now fumbling with the reins of his horse, a half-dozen of Silas's most loyal men, a rear guard he had secretly positioned, emerged from the shadows, their rifles raised. Silas hadn't just come for a duel. He had laid one last, posthumous trap. Cain was not running from the stranger, he was running to his salvation. The stranger was wounded, alone, and now faced a fresh, well-armed enemy. The pain in the stranger's side was a roaring fire, but his mind was a shard of ice. He was wounded, exposed, and trapped. Silas, even in death, had been a cunning adversary. The duel had been a feint, a performance designed to wound him and to herd Cain toward a hidden reserve of gunmen. Below him, at the base of the mesa, he could see Cain, now safely among his men, his terror being replaced by a triumphant, vengeful rage. "He's up there," Cain shrieked, his voice a high, thin thing on the wind. "He's wounded. Kill him. $1,000 to the man who brings me his head." The 6 gunmen fanned out, taking cover in the rocks at the base of the trail, their rifles pointing up at the ruined mission. They had him pinned down. It was a classic siege, and they had all the advantages, numbers, cover, and a target who was bleeding. The stranger stumbled back into the crumbling sanctuary of the old mission, collapsing behind a low adobe wall. He tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it against the wound in his side, the pain so intense it made his vision swim. He was losing blood, and he was losing it fast. He checked his Colt. 4 shots left. It was not a battle he could win. It was a grave he had been led to. He lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the sounds of Cain's men beginning their cautious ascent up the trail echoing in the twilight. He thought of his home, of the fire, of the faces of his wife and son. He had come so far, had sacrificed so much. To die here, at the hands of these hired thugs, seemed like a bitter, meaningless end. But as he lay there, listening to the wind whisper through the ruins, he felt not despair, but a strange, profound calm. He had faced down death so many times that it was now an old, familiar acquaintance. He would not die cowering behind a wall. He would die on his feet, facing his enemy. He would die the way he had lived for the past 3 years, as a fighter. He struggled to his feet, his wounded side screaming in protest. He looked around the ruined courtyard. He saw the body of Silas, the dead viper. He saw the crumbling stone cross where Cain had been tied. And he saw his rope, the lariat, still coiled near the cross where he had dropped it. An idea, a final, desperate, and utterly mad gambit, began to form in his mind. He stumbled over to the cross. It was made of a heavy, ancient stone, but the years and the weather had weakened its base. He put his shoulder to it, his muscles straining, the pain in his side a white-hot agony. The cross groaned, shifted. He pushed again, with a final, desperate roar of effort. With a grinding, tearing sound of stone on stone, the massive crucifix toppled over, crashing to the ground with a force that shook the very foundations of the mesa. He then grabbed his rope. He tied one end to the fallen cross, and the other, he fashioned into his signature, wide loop. He waited. He could hear Cain's men getting closer, their cautious footsteps crunching on the gravel of the trail. "He's in the church," one of them yelled. The stranger took a deep breath. He stood up in the open, in the last, dying rays of the setting sun. He was a perfect, solitary target. "Cain," he roared, his voice a raw, powerful thing that echoed across the mesa. "You want my head? Come and get it yourself, you coward." The gunmen, seeing him standing there, wounded and exposed, let out a triumphant yell. They rushed the last few yards up the trail and into the courtyard, their rifles raised, eager to claim the bounty. Jedediah Cain, his confidence restored, was right behind them. They charged forward, into the center of the courtyard. And it was then that the stranger, with his last ounce of strength, kicked the massive, fallen stone cross off the edge of the mesa. The cross, weighing well over a ton, did not simply fall. Tethered by the rope, it swung down in a massive, devastating arc, a pendulum of stone and righteous fury. The lariat, the tool he had used to hunt men one by one, was now the instrument of a wholesale slaughter. The swinging cross scythe through the charging gunmen. It caught them completely by surprise, a force of nature they could not have anticipated. The sound was a sickening crunch of breaking bone and stone on flesh. The men were not just killed, they were obliterated, swept from the mesa's edge like dust motes in a hurricane. Jedediah Kane, who had been at the rear of the charge, stared in utter, horrified disbelief as his entire army was wiped out in a single, terrible instant. He was alone again, facing the ghost. The stranger stood there, swaying on his feet, his face pale in the twilight. His final gambit had worked, but it had taken everything he had left. He raised his Colt, the barrel wavering, and took a stumbling step toward his final target. But he never made it. The world, which had been a symphony of pain and effort, suddenly went silent and gray. His legs buckled, and he collapsed into the dust of the mesa, the last of his strength, and his lifeblood, seeping into the unforgiving ground. He lay there, his eyes open to the first, cold stars appearing in the purple sky. He had done it. He had avenged them. The last of the rustlers were dead. Cain was broken, alone, and helpless. The town of Jericho was free. His last thought was not of vengeance, not of hatred, but of a quiet afternoon in a field of wildflowers, of the sound of his wife's laughter, and the feel of his son's small hand in his own. A single, solitary tear, the first he had shed since the fire, traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. The ghost had finally found its peace. The unforgiving sunset had come for him at last, and in its final, bloody light, he was no longer a hunter. He was just a man, going home. The dawn that broke over Jericho was the first true morning the town had known in a decade. It was not just the rising of the sun, but the lifting of a long, oppressive shadow. The news of the events on the mesa brought down by a terrified Jedediah Kane, who had stumbled into town, his mind shattered. Babbling of a swinging cross and a dying ghost spread not with the speed of gossip, but with the quiet, profound reverence of a prayer being answered. A small group of the town's braver souls, led by the one-armed livery owner, Pop, and the undertaker, Elias Thorne, made the somber journey up to the mesa. They found a scene of biblical carnage. The bodies of Cain's last men lay broken at the base of the cliffs. The body of the viper, Silas, lay in the mission courtyard. And near the center of it all lay the stranger, his face peaceful in the morning light, the faint trace of a tear still visible on his cheek. They found no identification on him, no name, nothing to tell them who he was or where he had come from. He was as anonymous in death as he had been in his brief, violent tenure as their savior. But as the undertaker gently prepared the body for burial, he found something tucked into the man's inner vest pocket, a small, faded tintype, cracked and worn with time. It showed the smiling faces of a young woman and a small boy, standing in front of a simple and painted farmhouse. It was the only clue to the man's past, the secret, tragic heart of his righteous fury. They buried him on the mesa, in the shadow of the ruined mission, his grave overlooking the town he had liberated. They fashioned a simple wooden cross. Not knowing his name, Pop, with a simple, profound wisdom, carved a single image onto it, a cold rope. And what of Jedediah Kane? Stripped of his enforcers, his power, and his sanity, he was just a broken, terrified old man. The people of Jericho did not form a lynch mob. Their desire for vengeance had been sated by the quiet man on the hill. Instead, they enacted a different, more fitting justice. They took back their town. Led by a newly formed town council, with the undertaker and Pop at its head, they presented Cain with a series of deeds. Not legal documents, but the handwritten testimonies of the ranchers he had ruined, the families he had terrorized. One by one, they forced him to sign over his holdings, the saloon, the bank, the hotel, the vast tracts of stolen land back to the community. His empire, built on a decade of fear, was dismantled in a single afternoon of quiet, determined paperwork. They did not imprison him. They did not hang him. They left him with nothing but his fine, empty house and the ghosts of his own making, a far more profound and lasting punishment. He would live out the rest of his days as a pariah in the town he had once ruled, a living testament to the fact that no kingdom built on fear can last. The rebuilding of Jericho was a slow and difficult process. The town had been deeply scarred, its people taught to distrust each other, to keep their heads down. But the stranger's sacrifice had planted a new and unfamiliar seed of courage. Inspired by his example, the people began to find their own strength. They formed a true town council, elected a new, honest sheriff from among their own, and began to work together to rebuild not just their businesses, but their community. The ranchers formed a cooperative, sharing resources and protecting each other. The merchants lowered their prices, extending credit to those who were struggling. The story of the lone cowboy became the founding myth of the New Jericho. He was their ghost, their guardian angel, a symbol of the terrible price of justice. The children of the town would dare each other to climb the mesa and touch the grave with the coiled rope, and they would tell his story in hushed, reverent tones. He was the man who had taught them that even the most untouchable of tyrants can be brought down, that one man, driven by a righteous purpose, could become a force more powerful than any army. The lone cowboy was gone, but he had left behind an inheritance, a town that had been given a second chance, a community that had learned to stand on its own 2 feet, a people who had inherited not his skill with a gun, but his unyielding, unbreakable will to fight for what is right. As the years rolled on, the West changed, but the story of the lone cowboy of Jericho endured. It became a ballad, a campfire tale, a piece of the rich, bloody folklore of the frontier. The facts, as they often do, became embellished with the telling. The man became taller, his gun faster, his deeds more legendary. He was no longer a man, but a myth, a pale rider of vengeance. Travelers who passed through the newly prosperous and peaceful town of Jericho would always hear the story. They would be shown the grave on the mesa, the simple cross with the coiled rope now worn smooth by the wind and the hands of curious visitors. They would see the undertaker, Elias Thorne, now the town's respected mayor, a man who had found his courage in the shadow of another man's sacrifice. And they would see Pop, the one-armed livery owner, now a cheerful, content old man who would tell anyone who would listen about the day the quiet stranger had ridden in and changed the world. The tintype, the small, faded photograph of the woman and the boy, was given a place of honor in the new town hall. It was a silent, heartbreaking testament to the man's secret sorrow, the wellspring of his terrible, righteous quest. No one ever discovered their names or the name of the town called Haven. It remained a mystery, a private tragedy that had fueled a very public act of justice. The photo served as a constant reminder to the people of Jericho that behind every act of violence, there is a story of loss, and that the truest measure of a community is how it cares for its most vulnerable. The legend of the lone cowboy had a strange, ripple effect across the territory. His methods, the way he had dismantled Cain's empire not just with bullets, but with psychology and strategy, became a cautionary tale for other would-be tyrants. The story of Jericho served as a quiet, powerful warning: do not push good people too far. Do not mistake a farmer's silence for submission, because you never know when a quiet, unassuming man might be a sleeping giant, a ghost with a ledger to balance. The town itself became a kind of pilgrimage site for those who had been wronged, for the dispossessed, and the victims of injustice from other, less fortunate towns. They would come to Jericho not seeking vengeance, but seeking inspiration. They would stand before the grave on the mesa and draw quiet strength from the story of the man who had refused to be broken. And so, the stranger's true legacy was not in the men he had killed, but in the courage he had inspired in others. He had been a man who had lost his own family, but in death, he had become the father of a new kind of community, one built on the principles of mutual respect and collective courage. There were, of course, whispers and rumors. Some said the stranger hadn't died on the mesa. A prospector in the high Sierras would claim to have met a quiet, blue-eyed man who helped him fend off claim jumpers. A doctor in a distant Oregon town would tell a tale of treating a stranger for an old, deep wound in his side, a man who paid in silver and disappeared before morning. But these were just stories, the echoes of a powerful myth, the desperate desire of people to believe that such a protector was still out there, wandering the lonely plains, a silent guardian in a violent world. The truth, as the people of Jericho knew, was simpler and more profound. The man was gone, but the ideal he had embodied, the idea that one person, armed with an unbreakable will, could make a difference, that was a thing that could never die. It was a ballad that would be sung as long as there were campfires to sing it around, a story of a lone cowboy who had become the enduring, unshakable soul of a town that had learned to be brave. The final chapter of the lone cowboy's story belongs not to the living, but to the wind and the dust. As Jericho grew into a prosperous, respectable town, and the raw, violent days of the frontier faded into a sepia-toned past, the grave on the mesa became a place of quiet contemplation. The wooden cross with the coiled rope eventually weathered and fell, and the town council, in a moment of civic pride, voted to replace it with a grand, marble headstone, with an inscription detailing the heroic deeds of the nameless savior of Jericho. But on the morning the stonemasons went up the mesa to install the new monument, they found that the simple and marked grave was no longer there. It was gone. The earth was smooth, covered with the native grasses of the plains, as if no one had ever been buried there at all. 100 different theories bloomed. Some said his body had been stolen by those loyal to Cain's memory. Others, more romantically, whispered that he had not been a mortal man at all, but a spirit who had simply returned to the earth once his task was done. The truth, as it was eventually pieced together from the quiet testimony of a few old-timers, was more poignant. A small, silent group, led by Pop and the Undertaker, had gone up the mesa in the dead of night. They had carefully, respectfully, exhumed the stranger's remains. They had also taken the faded tintype from the town hall. They carried him, not to the town cemetery, but to a quiet, secret place, a small, hidden meadow of wildflowers deep in the hills, a place known only to a trusted few. They buried him there, in a grave with no marker, under the shade of a lone, ancient cottonwood tree. They placed the tintype of the woman and the boy in the grave with him, reuniting the family in death as they had been separated in life. He wasn't a hero, the Undertaker was reported to have said, his voice thick with emotion. He was a husband and a father. He didn't fight for a town. He fought for them. They had understood the truth of the man in a way that no marble monument ever could. His story was not for public consumption. It was a private, terrible, and sacred thing. He had not sought fame or glory. He had sought a final, quiet peace. And in this unmarked grave, in this hidden, beautiful place, they had finally given it to him. And so, the lone cowboy truly and finally disappeared. His body and his secret sorrow returned to the quiet earth. He left behind a prosperous town and a powerful legend, but his true resting place remained a secret. A final act of respect for the man who had sacrificed his own name so that a town could reclaim its own. The open ending of his story is not a question of what happened to him, but a question he leaves for all who hear his tale. He was a killer and a savior, a ghost and a man. His legacy is a complex and uncomfortable one, a testament to the fact that in the harsh and forgiving crucible of the West, the lines between justice and vengeance, between a hero and a monster, are often drawn in shades of gray. He is a reminder that the West was not won by saints in white hats, but by flawed, broken, and sometimes terrible men, who, in their darkest moments, were capable of the most extraordinary and selfless acts of courage. His unmarked grave is his final statement: edge the deed, not the man, and remember that the truest legends are the ones whose names are whispered not in town squares, but by the wind, across the lonely, silent plains.